Good morning. I'm Mitchell Moss, the director of the Rudin Center for Transportation. I want to welcome everyone to this program about investing in parks. I can't think of a more important topic at this moment. Over the past year, we've seen that parks, especially in the New York area, have been so important to the mental health, the physical health, the community health of all New Yorkers. And they have become the refuge because most of us live in relatively small spaces. And it's the only place you can get fresh air and interaction with people, as well as some chance to exercise or at least enjoying being together in a socially distant way. We have two panels this morning. The first one is chaired by Carlos Azera, who, as you may know, is the president of the New York Building Congress. He had been the president and CEO of the Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce. You can't build anything in Brooklyn without Carlos's approval. I just mean that seriously. He was chief of staff to the Brooklyn Borough president, and he has been the chairperson of the Mayor's Advisory Panel on the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, a true lesson in patience and fortitude. And he will talk about his panel. We'll have a second panel after the first one, and our hope is to run this first from 9 to 9:45, and then from about 9:45 to 10:30. As I'm looking at the people who are here, I just want to say I'm so pleased that we've been able to draw upon New Yorkers from all parts of the city. And it means a lot to me. I really mean this, that we're doing this with the Trust for Public Land, the Building Congress, and New Yorkers for Parks, and AECOM. And I want to especially thank Jackie Snyder, Vice President AECOM, who has been the force that put this together, the plan that executed has made it possible for over 400 people to participate. But as I look through the list of attendees this morning, and I really want to say, I'm impressed with how many people who are doing things in New York and parks are with us, especially Lean Kavanaugh, the first deputy commissioner of the Department of Parks, and the deputy commissioner for capital projects, Therese Braddock, as well as my former student, Nick Molinari. And I don't want to mention everybody. It's such a great privilege, I think, to see. We have people here from Bronx River, from the Maju Park area. We also have Katie Denny Horowitz, I think, from North Brooklyn, and Lynn Kelly, who is now with the New York Restoration Project, Joe Jaron at the Department of Transportation. I can't mention everybody, but I want to say how pleased I am that we have people from all 5 boroughs, as well as from half a dozen states across the country. And this is a tribute to kind of ideas and innovation that come out of New York. So let me introduce Carlo, who will take over the panel. We are going to have room for questions. This is not going to be a typical panel where just the experts speak. We want your input. We have room for your questions. Carlo, it's yours.
Thank you, Mitchell. And I think whenever you've got Mitchell's name attached to an event like this, clearly it elevates the discussion. And Mitchell, I think most of the people who are watching are here because they're fans of yours. They like parks and open space and infrastructure, but we clearly know priority one is we're part of the Mitchell Moss fan club. So thank you. I'm scrolling through the attendees, a lot of old friends, a lot of people who have truly been instrumental in keeping the discussion and the actions on parks and open space and infrastructure alive. And I'm not going to mention names also, but I do want to also shout out Jackie at AECOM for all the work that she did in helping us get this together. So why are we here? What are we here to talk about? I think, we've always known parks and open space in a city like New York are critical pieces of our infrastructure. I think Mayor Mike Bloomberg clearly made that a priority, and we know what happened over 12 years with open space. But I think we learned in 2020 that having somewhere to go that is safe and open and inviting and allows you to breathe, particularly if you have children or elderly parents or relatives or even us who were on Zoom meetings all day and needed a little breathing time to get out. The open space was critical. We joined with New Yorkers for Parks back in August on an incredible report. And Adam, you and I have spoken about this before. We put out this report on the importance of investing in critical infrastructure around parks and open space. And at least in my tenure of 5 years, and I think even before me, it's become the most read and sought after report. So clearly, the moment in time is now. So let me just welcome the panel. I'm going to ask them each to give a 2-minute quick welcome, and then we're going to have a great dialogue. So Adam Ganzer, Executive Director, New Yorkers for Parks. Vinnie Albanese, Director of Policy and Public Affairs, New York State Laborers. Melissa Abramson, Senior Manager of Local Brand Engagement and Impact at REI. And of course, Carter Strickland, New York State Director, the Trust for Public Lands. So in that order, Adam, you want to kick us off?
Sure. I'll just give a quick introduction to who I am. I started as the Executive Director at New Yorkers for Parks in May. So the pandemic had been become a regular part of our lives. And I say this often, this job became infinitely more interesting and important to me as the pandemic and the economic crisis became clearer. New Yorkers for Parks is an independent advocate for parks and open space, both the existing parks and open space and the development of future parks and open space with a lens on equity and access. Prior to my time at New Yorkers for Parks, I was at the High Line for 10 years, overseeing the development, preservation, design of the section at the Hudson Yards, working with 2 administrations, community boards, related, and a bunch of other developers to get that project done. And the last thing I did there was work with projects across the country on the High Line network. Mauricio and the next panel will talk a little bit about that, but again, a lens on larger open space equity, economic development, et cetera.
Great. Vincent, you're up.
Thank you, Carlo. My name is Vincent Albanese. I'm the Director of Policy and Public Affairs for the New York State Laborers. We represent over 40,000 working men and women in the construction trades in New York State. We are, a lot of people don't know what a laborer is. They know what an electrician is or a plumber, but a laborer, we're pretty much involved in every facet of construction, whether it be underground subway work, tunnel work, roads, bridges, building buildings, demolishing buildings, hazardous remediation of those buildings, all sorts of heavy civil work, and every part, whether it be natural gas, renewables, wind, solar, we're involved in every part of the energy infrastructure of the state. And what falls in between there is obviously our open space and parks work. And a huge portion of what we do revolves around that. So it's great to be on this panel. And it's great to be able to get into really what the economic benefits for working people will be with this type of investment that I think we're going to talk about today. Great. In our open space. Thank you, Carlo.
Thank you, Vincent. Melissa.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Carlo. So pleased to be speaking on this panel with all of these very talented folks. I work for REI in our local brand engagement and impact sector. For those of you who don't know, REI is the largest consumer cooperative in the United States. Because we are a co-op, it actually positions us very interestingly to show up in a different way than a lot of other businesses. We are able to advocate, we are able to partner, and we are deeply entrenched in the communities where our stores show up. We've been working for over a decade to elevate outdoor recreation across the country, and the importance economically, and also the health benefits of being outdoors. And I'm really excited to speak about some really exciting things that have happened and transpired across the country and also within the state of New York in terms of really elevating outdoor recreation and its importance. Also, as Adam spoke about, as the pandemic ensued last year, seeing some really interesting trends across the country. So thank you.
Great. Carter?
Thank you, Carlo. My name is Carter Strickland. I'm the New York State Director for the Trust for Public Land. We're a national nonprofit that connects land and people, and really people to each other, as we know during the COVID period. That's the only place they can go, by protecting land and building parks like the park behind me. We have deep roots in New York City and have built over 200 of these schoolyards. But we're also national, and we have a DC office. It's important because, one of our key insights is that these local parks really there needs to be a federal program, and they are true infrastructure for cities. We need parks. It's clearer than ever in the COVID period. And that's because we know that they can not only keep people healthy, but manage stormwater, mitigate urban heat island impacts, and really create a strong society, for us. And I come to that insight in part from an earlier role where I ran New York City's Department of Environmental Protection, and parks are a key part of New York City's green infrastructure plan. So parks can have many roles, and I look forward to exploring those with this panel today.
Great. Carter, I think I want to start with that, and I know everyone has a different perspective of it, but what does a park and open space do for the city or the rural community or where they are? I mean, you look at the High Line, what it's done for economic development, or Brooklyn Bridge Park, right? In rural areas, it's different things. But Carter, you want to start with that, and then you guys jump in as you feel. But what's the economic impact? What's the community impact of having new development?
Well, just in general, and I'll let Adam maybe speak to some examples everybody knows about, how economic impact is really kind of localized. But from a general point of view, our economic studies in New York have shown that every dollar invested in open space returns $7 to the community. And that's because, Carlo, there's numerous health benefits. It's really, if you've looked at parks as part of a wellness agenda alone, staying outside, being healthy really saves health costs, which can be pretty tremendous down the road. And the public health impact, is very quantifiable. Obviously, there's a strong benefit to properties and neighborhoods around, but on a sort of more abstract level, parks make for strong communities. I mean, you can't imagine a successful city without successful parks, because this is where people go. And it's always been true. It's kind of the only game in town now, in the COVID period, but even beforehand, parks are infrastructure that provide, strong benefits. And I think cities realize that not only can it be sort of an anchor for redevelopment in areas, both, high end and in high need communities that really need open space, but they can also help manage stormwater, which is a big cost to city. They can help, having a tree canopy can be very important for air quality and keeping cities cool. So there's a number of benefits, and the returns are pretty strong in terms of investment.
That's amazing. Adam, I know you lived through a lot of what this means for development and communities. Give us some of your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking over the last, 90 years of park development in the United States. I think in the middle of the last century, it's always been in service of other policy initiatives, whether it's been urban renewal or slum clearing or highways. The latter part of the last century, starting in, say, the 1990s, return on investment became one of the drivers for park development in the urban centers. And I think the High Line is a perfect example of that. There wasn't a project being proposed that didn't include an economic impact analysis. And with the High Line, it was coupled with a rezoning of the entire west side. So it really became a development project, and with the park being a part of that development. And those impacts have been traditionally measured in increase in property values, increase in development rights, tax revenues for the city, tax revenues through hotel tax, property tax, sales tax, et cetera. And I think that all of those have, for almost all the projects that have been built, with that being one of the main driver, that there have been serious successes there. There have been also some drawbacks. This has raised questions around equity and displacement. Certainly, the High Line has met that head on, but I think there are a lot of projects out there that are shying away from moving forward until they get that they strike the right note on affordable housing and community engagement. And then the other big piece is a lot of these projects, while they get funding up front, there isn't anything on the back end to support the park long term. So the maintenance funding is sort of left to the private entity that is raising money around it. And you had mentioned Mike Bloomberg, who did build a lot of parks, but one of the other things that isn't noted is that the parks budget didn't increase sufficiently to support the parks that were built, which is why we're in a funny situation now where the Parks Department budget has not met the need, which is I think as important as developing new parks.
Melissa, I feel like you come through a different lens on this.
I was going to actually piggyback on what Adam just said around investing in infrastructure and bringing the economic investment of parks up to where the actual need is. And something that I think is helping that along slightly, we're not there yet, obviously, is in 2016, outdoor recreation was actually officially recognized as a significant contributor to GDP. And what happened when that recognition was made is it became people started paying attention to how much money was being generated by parks. And in specific, local parks, not national parks or federal lands, but local parks within cities generate $154 billion in revenue across the country, which is no small contribution. And so as we start to bring that conversation to the forefront and we start to elevate the actual economic impacts of these parks, and yes, of course, there's health benefits and of course there's community benefits. But for some reason, when you bring dollars into the conversation, it changes, it changes things slightly. When we're able to talk about the actual economic contribution that parks make, it makes legislation slightly easier. It makes lobbying slightly easier. And we've seen across the country changes being made, offices of outdoor recreation being opened in states across the country to actually really push for that collective response to outdoor recreation, advocate for it, advocate for the public lands in a collective way that is not so segmented and siloed. Which we see a lot in New York when our agencies aren't necessarily talking to each other. So I think that there's really, there's a lot to be said for the economic impacts. And I can keep talking about that. I would love to hand it over to Vinny to speak more about the labor contribution, but I think there is definitely really interesting conversations to be had when we bring the economic impacts into the conversation.
And we're going to get to that in a minute. Vinny, how does this affect jobs?
Well, I mean, I think it was mentioned a couple times here. There's nothing that spurs greater investment in a community than having great open space, great park space in the center of that community. So, you know, the tertiary impact of our investment in our transportation infrastructure, our roads, the surrounding building infrastructure around the park. There's nothing that spurs that investment, which creates jobs. Like when I spoke earlier about, we work in all facets of construction. But then the immediate impact is when you build a park, there's a ton of different trade skill sets that go into building that park. The people that actually work doing it. And I think it was mentioned, Adam mentioned the operations and maintenance side of that, which is also another, segment of jobs. But just on the construction of parks alone, it's a fantastic opportunity. Not that all the work we do isn't skilled work and doesn't require training, but when we do parks, it's an excellent opportunity to bring in new workers from the community to work on the parks in the community, because it's a great place to get trained and not have to worry about some of the other more hazardous, dangerous conditions often that you encounter in construction. So I would say you have the tertiary impact, but the direct impact, particularly in, at least from us as a union that is always seeking to grow and bring in new members, particularly in the communities we work and live, parks offer a fantastic opportunity for that.
And I think that's a great point. AECOM did an incredible study, and I'm going to ask Carter to talk a little bit about how it ties into what Vinny and Melissa and others have been saying about the jobs impact.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Carlo. In fact, this is, folks should know this is hot off the press on Monday. A study was released, prepared by AECOM. They did a great job, along with Rebuild by Design. And this was done for a coalition of New Yorkers who have come around calling themselves New Yorkers for Clean Water and Jobs, because that's exactly what is on the table. There was a proposal last year, it didn't happen, but it's still live for New York State to commit to a $3 billion bond called the Restore Mother Nature Bond. And the question was, what would the jobs impact be? And in fact, it found with that $3 billion in state money that would leverage for total project benefits of $6.7 billion in clean water, parks, open space, things that people need. And that in turn would create 65,000 jobs. And what's important about those jobs, Carlo, is that a lot of these projects are shovel ready now. Particularly parks projects don't have the long lead time of things that we all need, like and Mitchell knows well, like the tunnel under the Hudson River, right? I mean, that's a key part of the infrastructure, but that's going to take a long time to come about. If we need jobs this year, we should look at parks. And there's a number of other studies I will point out on the federal level. We work with a coalition, and there's a number of New York groups that have signed on to a letter to this administration to put in a plug for a $500 million set aside for parks as part of any federal stimulus. And that's because $1 million, in capital for parks will, generate, a number of jobs on the same, even more jobs on the operational side. So these can add up. And I will say that New York State, on a pretty regular basis, has an environmental protection fund that is hundreds of millions of dollars per year. And that's been wonderful, and even more for clean water. So all of this has created, a number of jobs. And I would say that, just to wrap up this point, just on a federal level, we have transportation, and it's implemented on a local level as parks would be, as clean water is. But there's a federal funding piece. Same with clean water, and those, by the way, are relevant to bike lanes and other open space. But for parks, we're really in a point now where there's something called the Federal Land and Water Conservation Fund. It's now, for the first time, permanently authorized, and $900 million a year in dependable funding. So again, that's an important recognition that parks are worthy of investment, and we should do it this year as part of the stimulus.
Great. I think, and you bring up a bunch of points, and I think we should spend a couple of minutes before I turn it over to some question and answers, and we are getting a bunch of them. What are the policies needed? So what does government or community or New York City, state, feds, whoever, what do we have to do to make this happen? For example, land use. I mean, New York has got what we know as the ULURP process, which you love it, hate it, but it's there, and it's probably not going anywhere, at least in the soon-to-be future. So what are some land use policies that we could do to make parks happen as we're doing rezonings? What kind of funding mechanisms do we need? Someone asked a question, I'm going to throw it out there now. How do we move towards 1% for parks in the New York City budget? So anybody want to jump in on this? Melissa or Adam, go.
Well, I was just going to piggyback on Carter's comment. Of all the projects, again, looking back at the projects like the High Line around the country that are, sort of these creative, large-scale urban projects that get built, many of them are getting federal funding. That's not the bulk of the funding that they're getting, but they're able to sort of shoehorn their mission in the way they describe their project into transportation dollars that are coming from the federal government. But it's never a perfect fit. And I think one of the things that needs to be recognized at the federal level is through all of these infrastructure, transportation, financing mechanisms, parks should be seen as a critical part of that and a partner. And one of the things that we've talked about a lot is that no project should be built as a single-use project, and a park should be part of any of these infrastructure projects that are involved. And the other thing I'll note is that in comparison to the costs of traditional infrastructure, whether it's road and rail, parks are a fraction of the cost. So a lot of work can be done with a little money in comparison to some of these other ideas. Going back to the question, 1% for parks, that was a campaign that New Yorkers for Parks had, I believe, in 2000. Currently, the budget for parks, this is the maintenance operations side, expense side, is about 0.5% of the overall city budget, which is well below almost every other large city in the United States, and obviously not sufficient enough to maintain our parks. 1% for parks could be a campaign that we bring back now, especially in light of all the use of our city's parks. And how parks are basically in the collective minds of all New Yorkers. So I think that there's a real opportunity now for us to switch the narrative a bit.
Great. I want to make 2 points before we go to Melissa. One, when we talk about parks, we're talking about just space, because obviously New York has a finite number of, square miles. So it's also about converting streets and other uses into open space and parks. And, I think, Adam, you touched on something that's critical, how we have to think about parks and open space as part of every project. And I think, when Rick Cotton unveiled the new Port Authority bus terminal project, part of it was 3 or 4 acres of new parks as part of that project. And I think, that brings us to the land use question. Like, are we utilizing our ULURP authority and ability to ensure that open space and parks are part of everything? Melissa?
Yeah, great. I think I can connect a few ideas. One of which is the idea of multi-use, looking at a park from a multi-use perspective and what that can do in terms of funding. And what we've seen, I have many examples from across the country. One in specific is with the LA River, in which there's a nonprofit that has been advocating for the LA River to be torn apart and be turned into a green, beautiful park to connect divergent parts of the cities together. And what really unlocked that potential was when they figured out that it could be a transportation mode for people in the city to commute between their jobs. And that's when the federal funding became available for that project. And now it's moving forward at a different speed, at a different pace. And so I think that the fact to really pay attention to transportation and the connectivity and access, it's all interconnected and all locked together. When you look at in New York City, as you said, there is an infinite amount of space, but how many roads do we have, and how much potential do we have to connect the hundreds of acres of park that we actually have across the whole city? And I know that there's several organizations that are working right now to create an interconnected trail system within the city. And when that happens, the really beautiful thing that we've seen in other cities is that people will be able to commute, to transport themselves in a different way that actually improves their quality of life. It improves access. There's equity that we're talking about here now, where there's equal access to parkland. And I think that piece that you can't diverge from is really figuring out how to make these parks multi-use. It can't be a singular focus on just creating picnic areas for folks. That's really limited.
Agreed. And I'm going to come back to something you said, Melissa, in a minute, but Vincent, give us your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we're talking a lot about, kind of city-centric parks, New York City. One thing I would just remind, the people listening is that when we talk about this investment, we talk about hopefully, federal money coming into this world. We also have to think about not just our urban park space and open space, but our more rural, New York is an expansive state. And when we look at the job creation that comes from building beautiful open spaces in other parts of upstate New York, that's a critical part of this. And also there's tremendous opportunity in some areas that, whether it be pre-COVID and then especially since COVID, have been hit, communities that have been hit economically, that have been devastated. And making sure that we're not just investing, although we're totally support investing more money in our urban open spaces, that we're not ignoring the economic impact of communities all around the state of New York, particularly in those more rural areas, that also, just because they're rural doesn't mean they don't need adequate park space. So, and that there's not people looking to work in those places as well.
I'm gonna jump to questions because we've got a lot of them and we only have about 10-ish minutes left, 15 minutes left. Equity is part of a bunch of questions that we've heard. And there's about 4 or 5 questions about equity, corporate sponsorships. Why are some parks obviously raising more money than others? It's something we clearly have talked about. I think everybody on this panel, I know Mitchell, you've talked about it in the past. So what do we do about equity? How do we finally tackle the issue of how do we get a park in East New York or Brownsville or, you know, the South Bronx to be, quote, treated equally as the perception of a park in Lower Manhattan or the High Line or something? And I open this up to any of the panelists who would like to jump into it.
Carlo,
why don't we start with you?
yeah, I'll jump in and maybe kick it off because I know we're all kind of obsessed with equity. It was a big part of our discussions leading up to this panel. There's no question. I mean, you know, we, Trust Public Land did a study showing that, you know, open space is, you know, there's much less open space in minority and low income neighborhoods across the whole country. And sadly, it's also true in New York. I do want to tip my hat to the New York City Parks Department with its community parks initiative, which has started to address the problem, but it's a big problem. And we need to find creative ways to create open space that might be streets, it might be playgrounds like the example behind me, you know, it might be repurposed rail in, you know, neighborhoods that really need parks, because you know, it's a sad fact that those areas without a lot of park space, you know, in New York City were those neighborhoods that had high incidence of, you know, COVID contraction and fatalities, you know, and that's not great. And also true for lesser ones, you know, public health issues. You know, nationwide, there are 100 million, you know, Americans who don't have access to a nearby park. So they're just not using parks as well. And that includes 28 million kids. So there's a lot of work to be done. And I think what we can do, Carlo, is there's a lot of good data and analytics. Every land use professional, you know, uses these tools, and we need to use them now and not be tied to our legacy park system, but think creatively about what the needs are now and how we can meet them the same way we do for other key infrastructure. To, you know, return to that point, you know, we build water infrastructure where there's population growth, same with transportation, same with schools, and we need to do it with parks as well.
Agreed. And I think we need to hold the mayor, the candidates running for mayor, and get them interested in this, because I think, and my friend Lynn Kelly brings up a great point in the Q&A, that we need to understand what is the platform. We know what they're talking about with the NYPD and what they're talking about with the vaccines and everything, but it's all tied together. If kids and people don't have open spaces, you know, a lot of other things can happen. So I think collectively we need to do that. Melissa.
Yes.
Corporate sponsorships, community involvement. How do we make it happen in communities that really aren't getting a fair share right now?
I think that something that Carter said, which I'd like to elaborate on, is listening to the community, listening to the organizations that are already in those communities that are not, they don't have a platform to share their voice. They are not being empowered. They aren't given the space to share their message, to share their needs, to share their wants, to communicate in a space potentially like this, where we are able to recognize and give them the time to help us clearly understand what's needed in their communities. I think there's a lot of prescriptive and oftentimes there's like a level set across policy and community that happens, and it oftentimes misses the marks in communities that need these parks the most. And so I think that that's the work that REI is doing right now, to really uncover what those needs are and how we as a large company can assist in lending our voice to advocate for that park space. I think it's less about companies coming in and paying for that to happen. I think it's much more about, as Carter said, creating a different process by which that can happen, creating, like, being more creative in how we're solving these problems, and less about, I mean, money always helps, of course. As I said at the beginning of the panel, it changes the conversation, but really it's about empowering the voices that are already present in the community to advocate for their needs and legitimize that.
And Vincent, before I come to you, Melissa, you bring up a critical point, and we've all talked about community, but there are a couple of questions, real pragmatic questions, which is, if I'm in a community group or I live in a neighborhood not near the High Line or Brooklyn Bridge Park, et cetera, how do I get a new park built, or how do I get my park fixed? Or, you know, I know near my park, there's a street that nobody uses. What do I do to get that to become part of the park? Like, what's the practical nuts and bolts of getting this done if you're a member of a community?
I think from what I've seen, and it's not the perfect solution. And again, we need to create more avenues for access, but I think part of it is community organizing. It starts at the very grassroots level, where if communities are invested in their parks, you can see them transform, and you can see the it's stewardship, it's recreation, it's creating if a park is run down, if it's not being taken care of, as we've spoken about, there isn't a ton of resources from the city level that's being invested in parks at the moment. It's not equitable. And so communities, that's when communities have to step in, and they have to step up and create the space that they want. And that's where organizations can come in and help support those community efforts.
Yeah, I'll just add that in New York City, the community board is sort of the first step for community members to make their desires known. Obviously, New Yorkers for Parks is a resource, but I do think that there is, in the last 10 years, there's been a different conversation around open space development in New York City as a response to the shifting issues around gentrification and displacement that has, obviously de Blasio came into office with the Tale of Two Cities rhetoric. And so I think that there is much more attention on this right now, but often you're talking about communities that don't have the resources to organize on their own, and they don't have the resources to get connected to corporate resources. So there's still a big gap there. I think that one of the things, this is like a bottom-up, top-down question, does the city have a master plan that identifies all of the spaces that are underserved, in bad condition, or all of the neighborhoods that do not have access to open space, either within their neighborhood or a way to get open space from their neighborhood? You talk about transportation infrastructure. Everybody in the world knows about Gateway. Everybody in the world knows about how the different highways are going to be planned. Why doesn't the entire city know what the next step is for the Parks Department and the vision around parks? They're just not talked about in the same way, and that's part of all of our jobs, is to raise this up to the other level of other infrastructure. The other thing I'll mention is that, Carter, you talked a bit about public health, and we talked about community development. We talked about economic development is measured in dollars and cents. I'm going to say this, is I am a guy who loves parks, and I get into the joy of parks, but there isn't a single thing that we're talking about right now that can't be boiled down to dollars and cents. What is the cost of not building a park? What is the cost to public health? What's the cost of resiliency and climate impact of not building a park? All these things are financial. All these things should be framed in that way, so we're understanding the cost of not building parks, not just the return of building parks. And I think we need to elevate the conversation, so it's not about, look how pretty the freaking park is. It's like, it's essential. And I don't know how else to frame it, but that's sort of my two.
Adam, I couldn't agree more. Just a quick thing. I mean, we've seen in other areas where we've been able to get significant public funding for parks. Often is preceded by an economic study. So the one we did for New York State to defend the Environmental Protection Fund is still, the source of legislature's comfort that $1 invested is returning $7 back. And we don't yet have that for New York City, but I think that would be a good place to start.
Okay, it is 9:40, and I know we have another panel that is going to really focus on the infrastructure of parks and open space. So before we go, and again, there's lots of questions here, and we'll try and see if we can answer some of them typing rather than speaking. But, I'd love to close it off with, and I do this every time I moderate a panel, I love to hear somebody's great big wish. So if you had one wish that you would love to see happen in New York City for a new park, a new open space, or renovate something unique and big, what would it be? What would you love to see? Melissa, you're up. What would you love to see? I'll give mine at the end.
Pie in the sky. I would love to see all of the streets that were closed during the pandemic becoming greenways.
Amazing. Vincent.
I think, I mean, you know, just from a labor perspective, but also from just someone who loves this city, I think I'd love to see more park space connected to our water space, connected to that we are an island, or at least Manhattan is an island, that and parts of New York City are on the water, and really emphasizing that and building around that, not just for the open space it provides, but for the resiliency benefits that will provide as we deal with climate change. So that would be my wish.
Sounds great. Adam?
I'm going to have a few, unfortunately. This connection from
one.
The connection from the High Line to Penn Station, just because I worked on that for a long time, but I really would love to see Flushing Meadows Corona Park become the park it needs to be, similar to Prospect Park, Central Park, and get the funding and get the attention that it deserves in that great borough.
Agreed. Queens needs it. Carter.
Yeah, I'll put in a plug for another Queens, you know, our most diverse borough, the most diverse place in the whole country. I'm going to put in a plug for the Queensway. It's ready to go. It's a rail that's sat unused for 60 years. And, you know, it's time to build a park there, a 3.5 mile greenway connecting, allowing people to bike or walk to 7 subway stations and Long Island Railroad, and kids safely walk to 12 schools. I think it's a no-brainer. Makes sense. It's already owned by the city, and there's a design for part of it. So I think that should be moved on right away.
Great. Well, mine is a big pie in the sky, which would be finally tear down the entire Brooklyn Queens Expressway, bury the whole damn thing, replace it with miles and miles and miles of open space, parkland, and obviously economic development projects where appropriate. So Mitchell, on that note, since I know you love the BQE as much as I do, I'm going to turn it over to you. But Vincent, Adam, Carter, and Melissa, really amazing to spend almost an hour together. And I hope we do this again. I think if we've learned one thing about us coming together is we need to come together more and really ensure that we're moving this agenda forward. So thank you, everybody. Mitchell, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carlo. And I want to thank the panel for working within the time limit. And I'm going to take 1 or 2 minutes to say that appreciate the fact that those of you who came late, I want to thank everyone for joining us. I'm really pleased that we have so many of the key players here. You know, Amy Chesler has, you know, been an essential force from listening to the city, now runs Rebuild with Design, and she did so much work after Sandy. And I see that Felice Farber of the general contractors are here, as well as some of her members. And I just want to say a couple things. And we have several of the people from the Hudson River Park. And if everyone, you know, I think you're going to hear, you always hear a lot about the High Line, but the Hudson River Park has done a great job at Pier 26. And I can only tell you, my mental health has been tied to the fact that you can walk along the Hudson. This pier is one of the great assets. And I think you should know that it's unlike Barry Diller's Island, it's a totally commercial-free park. You know, it's all beautiful and green and great place for people to sit and enjoy. I just want to say that we have listened to some of the great successes. And before I get to the panel, let me just say, I want you to know we're going to have much dialogue and we're going to come up with some crazy ideas, Carlo, I promise. So who do we have with us today? And first, I want to say I'm really pleased. We have Amy Freitag. Amy, as you may know, is the head of the Markle Foundation, which has been an important player in historic preservation and open space and human rights. And we're pleased Amy's here. Of course, she was earlier in her career a deputy commissioner for capital projects at the New York City Department of Parks. Those you don't know, New York City's had 3 great eras of park building. Obviously, the late 19th century, when we built Central Park, Prospect Park, and Van Cortlandt Park. During the New Deal, when Robert Moses, despite all the blemishes that Bob Caro has done to his career, Moses, every time he saw a piece of vacant land, he acquired it, made it a playground. That's why we have all these playgrounds in odd spots, as well as building swimming pools. And I don't think we've had any mayors build as many pools as Bob Moses. So I just want to say, if we didn't have those pools this summer, I'm not sure what we would have done. Sometimes you're known for your sins. This guy has, he may have done a lot of things later in life, but he built parks. And of course, the Bloomberg era, where he actually expanded parks more than any other mayor. Fortunately, Henry Stern's not here to get corrected. So let me start by telling you who's here. So we have Amy Freitag. We have Heather Morgan, who's speaking from Atlanta. Heather is she's a landscape architect, a landscape archaeologist. She's with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, probably the only human being I've met with the Corps. And she's also directing sustainability for AECOM in New York, and they're very active in Lower Manhattan, especially Battery Park City, where they have to correct all the errors of Charlie Erstad, who was Rockefeller's key guy when they were building it. And we have from the Highline, from the Friends of the Highline, Mauricio Garcia, who's trying to humanize the Highline, turn it in more than a fashion show. I think he's been reaching out to the community and providing some social connectivity for the Highline. So I think we have a very diverse and a kind of provocative panel. I just want to say something. I agree we need funding for parks, but we're not going to get 1% out of a city budget, which doesn't have enough money to even cover its deficit. And we've tried with this, but I'm going to give you one idea now, and I don't know if anyone here is in the press, but the MTA has failed to recognize that there is a new revenue stream available, which is the legalization of cannabis. So if they don't want it, it should go to parks. And if I can't think of anything better than the idea that you're going to feel high and feel good at the same time. And so, the problem with parks is everyone is tied to their local park. It's like parents, they're tied to their teacher and their classroom. But the parks constituency are vast, but they're disorganized. They're just the opposite of the bicyclists, who are narrow, but very connected. So if we could get parks people to all agree to go to Albany and tell Michael Generis and tell the state Senate that don't give the money to your friends, dedicate it to parks, you will find out that will do more for the mental, physical, and psychological health of New York than just spreading the buckshot around to the friend of the state, every state legislator. So that's my pitch, and I'm finished. So let me turn it over to Amy. I want Amy to talk about some of the experience she's had and what she sees as priorities for parks and investing in open space.
Hey, Mitchell, thank you so much. And thanks to all my fellow panelists and the Trust for Public Land and AECOM, Jackie, the Building Congress, New Yorkers for Parks. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to, Mitchell, if it's okay, I'm going to pick up right where Carlo left us, which is my moonshot. Okay. So what if I told you that right now in New York City, there are well over 175 acres of waterfront property that could become extraordinary parkland in some of our highest need neighborhoods? And what if I told you that by redeveloping that land, we could radically improve water treatment in New York City, making it 40% more cost effective and able to stop sewage from dumping into our rivers as we see increasingly heavy rainflows from climate change? And what if this project could eliminate disgusting, noxious fumes that are spread over some of our highest need neighborhoods? And that this project could develop new clean energy and new clean energy jobs in the city and stop our reliance on peak power plants. And best of all, what if I told you that this project could abolish a place that has destroyed the lives of hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers, right? So the wholesale redevelopment of Rikers Island is my moonshot, right? It's a once in a century opportunity to think big and do right in New York City. The real question is, Mitchell, can we still do big and complex projects like this? And is there a mayoral candidate out there who can seize this moment and capitalize on the opportunity? So just to touch on a couple points that were said earlier, and something my colleague Heather said the other day, is that no one piece of land can afford to have just one job, right? Parks need to absorb water, absorb heat. They need to improve public health, mitigate violence, and increase livability. Park capital projects should similarly solve for numerous problems. And that's what the redevelopment of Rikers gives us. Parks as net contributors, not net takers. But I really do fear that our city is becoming increasingly challenged to take on big and complex projects like this. And by the way, this is as big and complex a project as anybody has ever seen in the city. But we've actually made it almost impossible to build new high quality parks quickly and efficiently. And while I have this audience, I want to make it super duper clear. The fault of that does not lie at the Parks Department. City procurement kills parks capital projects. with a labyrinth of sign-offs and approvals and a bureaucracy that could stifle any innovation or any good project. So as my great mentor, the great landscape architect Laurie Olin has said, the problem is that people see landscape as like the sauce on the pasta, the thing that makes it look good and taste good. But we know that parks and open space are far more than amenities. And in fact, it's what's made New York City one of the greatest cities in the world. And that's often come at right on the heels of big catastrophes, right? Like the cholera epidemics of the 19th century were immediately followed by the construction of our two most iconic parks, Central Park and Prospect Park. And Frederick Law Olmsted had served on the US Sanitary Commission before he built those things, before he designed them, because he was worried about overcrowded cities and infrastructure. And on the heels of Spanish flu and the Great Depression, as you mentioned, Mitchell, in one summer, the Moses administration opened a monumental pool complex every single week in the hottest neighborhoods in the city. And after the financial crisis of the 1970s, a resplendent and restored Central Park signaled the recovery of New York City to the world. It restored pride and confidence and set a whole new model for public-private partnerships that transformed parks across the country and around the world. And then finally, after 9/11, you remember, Mitchell, we had the LMDC invest heavily in neighborhood parks that radically changed that historic neighborhood into one of the most vibrant places in the city to live. And so I think the question for us today is, how will we respond to COVID and the extraordinary inequity and high needs it's exposed, right? So quarantine New Yorkers obviously needed their parks more than ever. And not only did the city cut back radically on services for parks, but philanthropy, even philanthropy that came together to help New York City after the COVID, in the COVID crisis, carved out parks organizations as not eligible for that initial pot of funding. It's crazy, right? So we do need to set our sights a lot higher, and we need to challenge ourselves and our elected officials to keep New York City competitive by boldly investing in social justice, sustainability, and a healthier and more livable city. And so replacing one of the worst jails with state-of-the-art infrastructure, spectacular new parks is a kind of challenge we need to embrace in 2021 and beyond.
Well, Amy, thank you. I'm not going to, I just want you, you let us get many ideas here, including the Rikers Island proposal, but I think more importantly, the idea that parks have to be part of the mayoral agenda, that they have, everyone is discussing whatever idea they have, but the underlying part is that where people went when times were worse were the parks. They had locked up the playgrounds. I'm not going to ask about why, but one of the least intelligent citizens in the history of New York, because we know children don't spread this virus. However, parks were keeping people here. If you live in an apartment except for if you didn't live in a 2-bedroom apartment like some people, you had to go to someplace outdoors. And I think it's important that everybody was able to go to Bridgehampton or to Litchfield County or wherever else they went, to Wayne County, Pennsylvania. I think it's important here, though, we get to the other panelists. And I want to ask, Mauricio, to talk about, the High Line, because, you are now at a point where the High Line is not just the High Line. It's kind of got imperialistic characteristics, moving north and west and east, and even lending kind of a model for other parts of the city and country. So Mauricio, could you just give us a sense of, how you see the High Line expansion, bringing more people from surrounding communities into it?
Sure. Thank you, Mitchell, and thanks to the co-host and to the fellow panelists. First of all, I guess my name is Mauricio Garcia. I'm the Chief Program and Engagement Officer at the High Line. Kind of the elephant in the room that I'd like to just address from the onset, because there may be question, is there was a big announcement by Governor Cuomo a couple of weeks ago about the extension that I mentioned earlier. It's still early days for those plans in terms of your comment about the Empire. And so there's a lot of work to be done in terms of what we need to do, the discussions with the state, more importantly, the discussions with our community members, and not just the community board, with all the different folks who live in the neighborhood, particularly who have to live next to these potential new connections. But in terms of your question, one of the things at the High Line that we often talk about is our work both on and off the High Line. Everyone knows the High Line itself, and knows the impact that it's that has had on the West Side, both the good and the bad. And yes, we are free, accessible public space, both as our mission reflects. We're more than that. We are looking to reimagine the way cities and communities are actually exist. And so at the Highline, we're thinking more and more of ourselves as this neighborhood anchor institution. We've talked about jobs, we've talked about the economic impact. Neighborhood anchor institutions like cultural institutions, like hospitals, play an outsized role in general. And the Highline sees itself playing that outsized role on the west side of Manhattan and throughout the city. The big thing here is that there's a lot of responsibility that comes as being an anchor, both to our neighbors, to the communities we serve, and those communities we seek to serve. So for us, it's not about just the folks on the west side. It's about folks who live in outer boroughs who haven't had either the experience of enjoying the Highline or other types of parks of that nature, or don't see the Highline as being something for them because of all the different media that you see about the Highline being a fashion show, as you mentioned before. And I didn't put on my tie or my sport coat today because I'm not part of that fashion show. But again, it's really about the Highline and the public spaces that we support throughout the country through something called the Highline Network, and locally through something we call the local Highline Network, where we're increasingly embracing our role as community wealth generators, and not just jobs for when there's construction, but the fact that there's a lot of needs in the neighborhood that we as these anchors can help kind of connect, whether it's employing folks, whether it's helping small businesses, whether it's helping our local human services organizations with work they do, like we did this past summer. And this is a critical case. You know, thinking about the first panel, this is a critical case to make for future parks and capital project initiatives. And that's something that the Highline and me personally, we're committed to doing as we move this conversation forward.
Thank you, Mauricio. I just want to say I've read 32 questions. I'm trying to read them as people speak. And I just want to say before we get to Heather Morgan, I feel, you know, I've seen questions about McDonald Park in Queens from Maggie Greenfield about the Bronx. This question of how communities without intrinsic wealth can access capital is really important. And I want to point out that that is the point I think we have to deal with in part, is that, you know, the maintenance and operation of parks is going to be, is often a result of politics, you know, result of pressure on your borough presidents, pressure on the council people. And, you know, I think that this is one area city council members can do is they can kind of find ways to target money for capital projects. And I think you should know that's how the Parks Department capital budget's always grown. Council members put the money in some cases, and then the city accepts it. So I just want to point out that, you know, it takes the communities to kind of organize and then force, and because parks can be done faster than schools. Whatever you think, you can get a park rebuilt a lot faster than you get a public high school done. So I'm a big fan of that. And that's the second part I just want to say. We're going to go to Heather, and I just felt I had to comment also. Katie Denny Horowitz had a question with the Environmental Bond Act. Later, Carter, if we, you know, the governor, when he makes an announcement, it's like Julius Caesar pronouncing this is going to happen. Well, the bond issue, there's no reason the state legislature can't push for a bond act. This is the time to borrow money. Interest is less than 2% when the public's borrowing it. And the state of New York should be borrowing for parks and open space now, because this is the one time when capital is so low that you can do it and pay it off over the future. So let me go to Heather Morgan. Heather, tell us, really, I think you have a big picture perspective on how cities have to adapt to the 21st century. Thank you.
Yeah, so pleasure to be here. Thank you everyone for having me here. I greatly appreciate it. I think what Amy and Mauricio already said, I mean, the aperture that you guys covered was fantastic. Thank you. So my position at ACOM is Sustainability and Risk Management Lead for New York City Metro. And I also just want to extend a thanks to Jackie Snyder, my teammate, for bringing us all together today, helping bring us all together. I really appreciate that. Just a little bit too on the background is after leaving the Corps, as Mitchell, you had mentioned, I've had the privilege to work in the New York City area on flood resiliency projects, and specifically for Battery Park City Authority and the South Battery Resiliency Project. And that has really broadened the lens as well on this topic for me as well, coming from federal agency back to private sector and working for the authority on that project. I think, Mitchell, to round out the comments that have already been thrown out here at the beginning of the panel, is that I'd like to bring in an applied ecology perspective to the narrative that we're having today. You're right, Mitchell, my landscape archaeologist background does kind of pivot me in a little bit of a landscape typology context. And so if I piggyback a little bit to what Amy said, I think that in front of all of us as New Yorkers, we have an unbelievable opportunity to view our comprehensive park system in all 5 boroughs as a vascular system, and vascular for not only sustaining the way that we live, but so that we can thrive into the future. I view that vascular system to not be so human-centric. I view that to be as biodiversity pathways and ecological enhancement. I think if we could pull back the anthropomorphic layers that we've seen in New York, Mitchell, you mentioned Moses. I mean, we go all the way back to the origins and European alteration of Lower Manhattan and other areas. I guess my moonshot would be, as New Yorkers, if we could look inside ourselves and revisit the fact that we are in the confluence of 2 major rivers and a coastal estuary, and that what would our park system look like if we were to take that into consideration with our land planning and our design criteria. The other thing that I'd like to bring in is kind of the tactile nature of design criteria and value systems showing up in our zoning, in our planning. The first panel mentioned Europe. You know, these bureaucratic personalities and silos, Amy, you mentioned procurement, as well as what we have for design criteria in the 5 boroughs, it has to evolve and adapt with what we're facing. And so the other aspect I'd like to bring into the dialogue is this new generation of robust multi-layered design criteria. I do not view parks in the New York City region as being just parks, and I am not in any way discrediting the role they've played in contribution into our society. What I'm saying is we're going to add layers onto those. We're going to amplify the importance of parks. And those of us that are mentioning the struggle, the hard struggle with the O&M of these public assets, and we have to understand that if we start to multi-layer them, our O&M budgets need to expand to nurture and caretake that these are becoming risk performance landscapes now. These are no longer just park landscapes. The other aspect of that is that when we introduce risk performance landscapes, we can't just look at flood resilience. These park systems need to serve as catalysts for unpacking all of our climate crisis needs: heat indexing, greenhouse gas emission, carbon management. And we need to look at the entire water cycle, our interior drainage, our coastal surge as well. But I know right now, especially after Hurricane Sandy, there's been a lot of understanding of coastal surge, but our impervious surface and our altered manipulated landscapes, our interior drainage and our storm water is becoming even more of an issue. And so when we have the COVID pandemic and we have a climate crisis, I think all of us need to revisit what we want our future to be with this relationship with parks. And parks demand and deserve that attention, that funding, and that caretaking. The last thing I want to mention is that projects on the waterfront, supporting the Rikers proposal that Amy had mentioned, supporting many of the other projects that all the other people on the panelists are supporting, whatever we can do to really amplify an all borough response, I would really like to see that. Long Island is obviously a Long Island, but the thing that's incredible about it is it's got the Long Island Sound, the Atlantic Ocean, contiguous Back Bay communities that need as much attention as the front edge for coastal surge. And so I'd really like to see us cross-pollinate these efforts across all the boroughs as well. East Harlem the other day was mentioned as well in the news for more attention up there as well. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Heather. I think you made, I think, several important points. I just want to go back to this question, and I think Amy started. Rikers Island, the High Line, these are reusing urban infrastructure. And you pointed out we have 175 acres, you know, Amy produced a waterfront property. But if we understand what city has done is that before we would fill in and create parks. Now we're not doing that, but we've reused Governor's Island. And by the way, we should tell the Mr. Yang that the Congress imposed a rule that you could not have any commercial activities till 2062. So when he runs for mayor in 2063, that might be a realistic idea, but not till then. I think, but reusing infrastructure, and I just want to point out, what could be more wasteful than having 60-year-old railroad connection in Queens when you can make it a park. And I think this is important. It's been the High Line has been supportive of this, but the Queensway, is one of those areas which it runs through a multiplicity of neighborhoods of all different ethnicities. And so I think we have to reuse infrastructure. I appreciate the Maggie Greenfield's comment about, the challenge, in the Bronx River and other areas, as well as Mr. Melnick's point about the parks that are neglected because they don't have modern water drainage, because they haven't had maintenance operation. And that's why I think a revenue stream that could be dedicated to parks is going to be more important, or a bond issue, which has been mentioned. I think we can't just build new parks, we have to rebuild the other ones. And I think the other part is this should be a kind of an aggressive effort as we are approaching a June primary where we have all kinds of people discussing things. How do we make the city livable? Well, we have a surplus of office space. So the governor said we should put housing there. Why not have some of that office space, which is not generating taxes anymore because no one's paying rent? Why not we take some of these obsolete industrial buildings, obsolete office buildings, and let them be kind of small scale neighborhood parks? In other words, we have to be bold and understand that if you're not going to have people paying rent to work in some of the obsolete structures, there's nothing better than making that an open space area. You're adding value to the surrounding land, to the surrounding properties. So it's going to take kind of an understanding that sometimes less is more. If we take out a building that's not being economically productive, it might add to the productivity of everyone who lives and works around. So let me go to the other. If I just want to invite, Mauricio or Amy, and then it looks to me like we have 30 plus questions. So I just want to get to them as well. So if anyone on the panel, and I know we have a limited amount of time.
I'll just jump in real quickly. I mentioned this on our prep call with these folks. My background tends to be in community development and human services, and a big through line to that is community engagement. And a previous panelist mentioned community organizing. That's important, but it's also the continuity and consistency of this engagement and the supports that are being provided to, whether it's block associations, whether it's other types of small scale civic associations. That's gonna just move the needle slightly. So the biggest question is, how do we support those existing neighborhood leaders and institutions that might be super tiny to be able to make these big, bold bets, whether it's Rikers, whether it's converting the open streets into actual greenways. Those are the kinds of issues that I focus on. So if you ask my question, what is my big bet? Those big ones that everyone mentioned are important, but for me, it's the small scale ones. It's the scale and the volume of these small parks, whether it's the greenways or the open streets. To me, that would get to the equity issue, and that's the other piece. We talk about equity, but do we really understand what equity means? We use this term so often, and I feel like there is a literacy aspect to equity that's related to engagement, and oftentimes the equity piece falls on the engagement, but that shouldn't be the case.
Well, I think the importance of having small scale parks and open space is going to be more important because that's where people spend their time. And we're finding out that just as a matter of getting out, in order to live with this pandemic, we have found out that people want to be outside. They should be outside. And I think for the most part, this is a great point you make about doing things which connect to where people are. And not just the big projects. I think the big projects have their own benefit, and I think this is one of the challenges that we have got to. The city of New York, actually, it's not a matter of money. I think the comment about procurement that Amy said is correct, but I think it's the will to have a 10 or 12 year effort to get something major done. That's what happened with Moynihan Station, and that's I think one of the great successes. The Hudson River Park has been I have to give Diana Taylor and Madeline Wills great credit for what they did over the past 15 years, because that's now serving, every pier is now vital and energetic, day, night, weekend, evening, because that's where people go when they want to have some chance of kind of human connection. I think we fail to recognize the New York parks are not really like rural parks. Here people actually go to parks to have interaction with people, as well as exercise and everything else. It's not as if you're going camping and you're isolating and you want to be surrounded by natural life. Here you're really going to parks to be surrounded by people. It's actually the only place where human contact is allowed. We can't dine with people. We certainly can't, go to work with people. So you might as well go to a park. That's the last refuge of what face-to-face contact is available in New York City.
So Mitchell, can I throw out an idea? I mean, I hope I can enlist all 236 of us to get behind my new campaign, which is Heather Morgan for Open Space Czar of New York City. But the bottom line is, like, we actually did the study with the Nature Conservancy. The city doesn't even know all of its open space assets. Isn't that crazy? Like, we think of this as a parks issue, but DEP, DOT, they have control over a massive amount of open space in the city. And it's probably not an accident that the last time that was looked at in a more sort of complex way was when Robert Moses held how many jobs in New York City government. So our siloed approach makes something like Rikers really, really hard. But back in sort of the Bloomberg days, we kind of said, if you didn't know an asset, if you couldn't measure it, if you didn't know what it was, you couldn't manage it well. We don't really know our open space assets fully in the city. And until we have a structure in government that really takes that as a massive resource in New York City and manages it well, all the things that Heather has talked about really aren't possible. And so that's my hope for a new mayor, that we can think more complexly about our open space.
So I think you have, Amy, I'm going to appoint you to be in charge of mobilizing with Lynn Kelly, because I think the challenge is you can't wait till someone gets elected. You have to make this a priority, so they promise it, so then they have to keep it. That's one part. And the second part is that, I think your point is the city of New York has a vast amount of land, and some of the land they don't even know about, as you point out. Some of it is in parking lots, some of it is, but also we have nonprofits. I can take you on Woodhaven Boulevard and show you more religious institutions with vast parking lots, which are only used for 2 hours on a Sunday at best. And so I think the key part is to find ways to use the space which we have. And that's been a success of New York over the past half century, reinventing the use of land that has now, been wide foul. Those piers on the west side were empty for half a century, and now they're being used by people. I think the same approach, and I think this is across all the boroughs. I really think that it's not something which we should do. Someone asked a great question: how do we actually finish the East River Esplanade? And I think this is a great opportunity can we figure out a way that someone can actually walk along the East River Esplanade without having to go around Pier 36 there, over the old banana boat pier, and figure out a way we can make it safe for people to bike or walk the whole length of the East River. The Hudson River has a great advantage. You can go from one point to another. The East River is an obstacle course. So I think these are great questions. I want to get to some of the others here. And one person said that their wish, is, I think this is important, is that the Ridgewood Reservoir, another great urban space, and they pointed out, how do we deal with that? There's a proposal I know that Tom McMahon has been promoting for the Brooklyn Greenway. So there are no shortage of ideas, but I think there's a shortage of making this a centerpiece for when we're electing people. The whole city council, 35 members, are going to be out of a job. That means we have 35 opportunities to kind of influence what they're doing. And I think this should be, remember, the council races have 500 people running for them. So everyone here was asking a question here, that has got to be part of your local councilmanic debate, because it's, if you want to get a community to work, I think having open space and parks has turned out to be one of the lures for people, much more than it's ever been ever since this pandemic started. So I want to get to a couple more questions. I just want to say that you should keep them coming. I think we have one here, which is this question I want to raise. And Maggie Greenfield said, we have a two-tiered park system in the city. There's a discrepancy between keeping up the parks we have, especially in low-income neighborhoods. Many of existing parks are in deplorable condition. How do we move forward toward a more equitable maintenance system for our parks? Now, I know we have a lot of talented people in the Parks Department here. And I just want to say this is a great question, because there is kind of a maintenance need in some of the parks which have gone unmet. And I remember when Washington Square Park was renovated, Ed Koch, a very gutsy guy, didn't have the guts to renovate Washington Square Park. For all his great bravado, he could never take on his neighbors. But Bloomberg didn't care about the hippies in Washington Square Park. Clear them out, and the park is far better, more productive, it looks better. And thank God for the Parks Department, they did a spectacular job. And there's more space for people there. And I think we have to take that approach to understanding that around the city, the assets have to be reinvested. Like every building has to have a new roof after half a century. Well, every park system has to figure out water system, drainage, and other landscaping. So, Amy, I know we have two Amy's who really know everything about parks, and then we have people, the Parks Department. I don't want to force you, but anyone should know this is the biggest challenge, getting the parks in the unknown neighborhoods, put it that way, or the less known neighborhoods, to get equal access to capital and renovation.
Well, I'd love to hear Heather talk more about East River and other places, because I know she thinks a lot about this stuff. But I'll just quickly say that I think we have a lot of work to do to be a lot more creative about how we bring maintenance and operation dollars to our parks. And one thing that we've been working on with the Natural Areas Conservancy, the Kaplan Fund has been working on this idea of monetizing carbon absorption, right? All of our parks and open space do that, and they do it just as well in the South Bronx as they do in the middle of Manhattan, right? So the idea that we can find new sources of capital that really relate to climate change and being able to monetize the ecosystem function that Heather was referring to, really is something that we haven't even begun to do, but it's on the cutting edge of the way states are looking at absorbing carbon and mitigating climate impacts. And we have a lot of opportunity to do that in New York City.
So I think if there's one thing we've learned today is that there's enough energy. I think it's probably more diffused, and we've got to focus it, I think, on this spring electoral system, because I think people, the emails coming into me connect this. I think the other part is that it's not just new parks, it's rebuilding parks, and it's not just the showpieces, but it's the places that are really kind of been neglected and overlooked. And, for 50 years, McCarran Park had been kind of neglected. I won't say why, but you should know, I have friends who didn't want to give up the concerts. Oh my God, we're going to get rid of the concerts. Well, we now have the concerts on the river, and the pool is open, and that is added to the lure. The best people who live in Greenpoint and the surrounding area of Williamsburg, those areas are thriving because we invested in the park. And I think it's something to recognize that it actually strengthens communities. It strengthens the capacity of people to live there if they know they can go and enjoy the area around them. And I think I just want to point out that, this vast amount of land. I see we have a comment, another one about NYCHA, which has so much open space. I can't dare mention this, but the parking at NYCHA is about $24 to $42 a month, and it's viewed as a sacred right. But there's vast open space available, which could be used not just for revenue, but to improve the use for the local residents. Are there any other questions we have? I want to make sure we don't miss them. I'm trying to kind of skim through them. Some of them are even tougher enough for this panel. But since somebody did, Cindy Casey's mentioned soil biology, we have to throw this to Heather. Let's test how much she knows. There are parks in Brooklyn where we have limits to contaminated soil. So what remediation is happening there? This is a real question of equity. Heather, have you ever dealt with this issue of contaminated soil?
Yes, unfortunately, yes. But what was the specific reference for the park?
Well, how do we deal with, how can you what are the limits when you have contaminated soil? Because this is going to be one of the big issues up at Rikers as well. This is doable. That's not a permanent problem.
There's many people that can speak about this as subject matter expert much better than me, but I'll do a land.
But we have you, so we got to go with the army we have.
Yeah, let's do this, right?
That's what my friend, secretary, we had a great secretary of defense. You go to war with the army you have. We have a panel, we go with who we have.
Well, first off, where I learned about remediation was at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and I'm a better person for working there and the people I worked with and learned from. That being said, that, as everyone's mentioned, with the limited amount of space that we have, it always depends on what are your contaminants and how to handle those contaminants. And unfortunately, until you know what those are, you don't know situationally what you can do on site for containment, or if you have to remove and relocate and store elsewhere. So I think when it comes to remediation, it really depends on the exact site. It depends on the exact site's exposure to groundwater. It also, and surface water and any other types of influences that would come in that I would call risks. The one thing I do want to mention when it comes to remediation, but also the topics that were kind of bounced around just a few minutes ago. I learned this at headquarters for the Corps, and I mention this a lot on our teams, and I'm sure some of my teammates get tired of hearing me say this, but I mean it when I say it. We all have incredibly complex work environments that we're in. You don't deal with this type of public service and not have this palimpsest of stuff that could make me just not be able to sleep at night because I can't get things done fast enough, especially with climate change. But what I can say is that relationships matter. I have never seen a project that could not be designed. I had never seen an O&M manual that couldn't be written. I've never even seen a fiscal budget that couldn't be somewhat figured out. The thing that breaks down is relationships. And all of us as individuals have that power to build our relationships around these issues and continue to make that happen. Highline, Mauricio, I mean, come on, how that started and how everyone on the panel earlier was mentioning not-for-profits pushing things in the beginning. But I think that relationships is how we get through the adaptation and fund it and elevate the parks, what I would call the vascular system, to a much more high priority. In addition to that, I think that adaptation does not come impact-free. It does not come, especially in a place as dense and as valuable as space is in New York, and as valuable as waterfront access and social infrastructure is. And so when we look at this, we have to have transparent conversations with each other, that we will have trade-offs. Amy, you mentioned Lori Olin earlier. You know, we have designed landscapes all along these waterfront edges that now we have to look at adding dimension to them. And unfortunately, we will have to modify them. And so we have to have transparency. We have to have humility and respect for what was there before, but we also have to lean in really hard to what's coming. And the only way we'll have those transparent dialogues and hold each other accountable when we're impeding a process is by being really taking care of each other, respecting each other, and nurturing our relationships around these issues. Go and meet someone in one of these parks and sort out a fiscal issue and wear your mask, right?
So let me say we have we've got a few minutes. I just want to say we've had several people propose specific projects, and Stacy Pappas points about East River Esplanade. There's a person who points out Inwood Hill Park has had a building damage since Sandy that has been neglected. I think that we've heard about the demand. I forgot about Bushwick Inlet Park. It has yet to be built in an area which is booming. If you haven't been to Greenpoint's, one of my favorite parts of the city, really. And I think obviously the Queens Greenway, Flushing Meadow Park. I just want to point out to you that the High Line, at 2 times in its history, the mayor of New York, this is the current personal lawyer for the president, ex-president, signed a demolition order. Did you know that? I have a copy of it here. The demolition order had been signed twice by Rudy Giuliani in his mayoralty. And yet it's one of the great assets. It took a long time, but it's done, and it's changed the West Side along with the Whitney Museum, I would argue, and I'd say the Hudson River Park. But what is crucial here is that you can make a project happen, and you can even turn around a bad decision, but it doesn't happen unless you kind of work within the political system and you kind of mobilize. And there are no enemies to parks, but there is nobody organized to build them and get them done unless you have some leadership. I think the great irony here is that it's easy to oppose a building. People don't oppose parks, they just ignore them. And I think that's where Amy Chesler and Amy Freitag, and I think the great people at the Department of Parks know that every New Yorker has somehow experienced the park if you don't have a second home. So if we got everyone in New York who's second homeless to support parks, you would be able to get everything done. And I think you should think about that. And Lynn Kelly, I'm going to point to you to make sure this happens between now and June 20th. Now, are there any other questions that have come in? I want to make sure, but I've tried to summarize some of the key projects, which I think are all doable. They've been on the agenda, but they haven't moved. So, and I'm going to ask the panelists for any closing remarks. And certainly I want to say if anyone on the other panel wants to offer, please do. So let me start with you, Amy. This is your last shot. It's Amy Freitag. I want you to, give us your best. Instead of, I don't really believe that there's one great idea. I just want to say, what's the great strategy to get something done?
Rikers is a good idea, Mitchell. Stick with me on that. But no, I'm going to go back to something Adam said earlier. There's no premier city in the world that finances both the maintenance, operations, and capital of their open spaces in as parochial way as New York City does. It's just ridiculous. We don't have that big plan, and we don't have a funding stream or funding mechanism. We do this on various council members get to recommend projects. That's not the way you manage an open space system in a city. It's just insane. So as everyone has said on this whole morning, it's about prioritizing parks so that they aren't the afterthought or the perk. They are in fact the key that everybody understands underlies all of our economic viability, our competitiveness as a city, and our sustainability moving forward. So I think it goes to a pretty deep place in city government to rethink their capital and maintenance and operations around parks. And we just got to believe that an income, 500 people running for office right now in New York City need to hear that message, because New York City is going to fall behind if we don't take that seriously.
I think this is really, I appreciate that point. I think you should know Rikers should be the governor's island of the next mayor. In other words, we have a vacant island, almost vacant, ready to, and it's going to take massive amount of time and commitment. I just want to say something. New York, Paul Goldberger once said something. He said, New York is not known for its great buildings. It's known for its great spaces. It's known for its parks. It's known for plazas. It's known for Times Square, but this is not a city in which it's not, this is where people come to experience the city, the streets, the sidewalks, the parks, one time even the theaters and the stores, but they don't, the office buildings, it's hard to even see them because they're so densely packed next to each other. And so they're a magnet for tourism. They're a magnet for people to stay here. And I think, this is one thing we've learned this morning is that, there's no reason we can't be an environmental bond issue on the agenda. In fact, why should George Pataki have had the last environmental bond issue? We should blast people in Albany and say, this has to be done. There's no reason not to, especially with rates of interest being so low. Anyway, let's go. Are there other people who want to speak? I want to ask, particularly Mauricio, if you have any comments, I want to invite you, and Heather as well.
Go ahead.
We have about 2 minutes left, and I want to say in our time, so each one of you.
Mauricio, go ahead.
Heather, go.
Go ahead,
Maybe
Heather.
you can do it in 60 seconds, Heather.
Okay, I guess one more comment would be, I think when it comes to what we really want to see, I think that we have to pull back and step back from the actual existing conditions. But when it talks to Amy, what you were nodding at about, how do we push these things through? How do we get them done? I think we have to step even further back and let the actual physical, factual, scientific location of these areas to guide us in how we prioritize them. I think on the earlier panel, I think it was Adam Ganser had mentioned, a large scale plan that identifies the most at-risk places. And at risk is also for social infrastructure and access and equality, as Mauricio is saying. So to me, it almost seems like those types of plans have to be at a higher elevated space than our human, political, bureaucratic, procurement processes. Those have to be something that is something we all understand. It's all transparent. It's communicated publicly. And then we as public servants can chip away at that plan. So I agree with having things elevated, very visual, very transparent, including anything at the mayoral level campaigning right now. And then how are we going to unpack that? I think it's visibility and transparency.
Thank you. Mauricio?
Sure, and I'm kind of preaching to the choir. But first of all, thank you to everyone who put this together. It was fun. Preaching to the choir, but parks and open spaces like the High Line and all the projects we've been working with across the country and locally have the potential to become some of the most diverse gathering places, and many are already in our cities. Providing spaces where our folks and residents can have really amazing shared experiences, build connections, build social capital, cohesion across income, race, geographic, and so many different barriers. Those connections, those social connections really are kind of the engine of equity, providing that kind of shared and common experience that social infrastructure was talked about before, that strengthens that social infrastructure as well as a community resilience. And gives folks really increased agency to really kind of think about how they can rethink and reimagine their neighborhood or their community. But if public space investments increase the economic value surrounding these neighborhoods, how can we as park stewards, open space stewards, and advocates capture that value for the benefit of those existing residents? And that means, again, going back to procurement, community benefits agreements, and so on. And that question is really kind of what I'm chewing on ongoing as we consider how the High Line kind of, thinks about itself in 10, 20 years, as well as some of the parks and open spaces we support across the country.
Well, thank you. The High Line, if we can clone the High Line in Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx, you'll have done more than just one project. You'll have spread the example. I want to thank Jackie Snyder, who organized and made this happen, and Kieran Liftali of the NYU Rudin Center, who's managed to keep this going we've had several hundred people here this morning. And I especially want to thank everyone who's joined us, because your questions helped fuel the dialogue. I hope that enough of you have been mobilized to do something. I just want to say that, I've learned a lot. I hope you have. I think that's what we do at the university. We try to educate each other and ourselves. And I hope that it's been a productive morning. And I want to thank the panelists, especially, Amy and Mauricio and Heather, as well as the earlier panel, and Carlo, especially, for moderating. And I hope you have a good day, and I want to stay well. And I only say that parks and open space are going to be more important in the next 9 months. We're going to have schools closed. We're going to have office buildings still partially used. But if we don't have the parks and open space working, the city's not going to have any chance of really making it livable. So anyone here should know that this should be the #1 priority. Every time you ever have a chance to speak to an elected official, there's nothing that's more urgent than recognizing this is the central life force of the city, at least for the next year. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Paul.